just now proceed and introduce the first speaker, Joao Gabriel. So Joao is a Pan-Africanist activist from Guadeloupe in the Caribbean and a PhD student in history. Joao works on the place of prison in the debates about the abolition of slavery in the French July monarchy. And Joao writes a blog called Le Blog de Joao on issues related to African diasporas, slavery, the Caribbean, and gender. Thank you so much, Joao, for joining us, and over to you.
Hello everyone. So thank you for this presentation, and again thank you for the invitation. So feel free to tell me if I speak too quickly, because English is not my as we say, mother language. So I'm totally open if you need me to rephrase something, because sometimes some key ideas can get lost. So feel free to wave or something. I won't mind at all. So today what I'm going to talk about is mostly, let's say, a critical reassessment of the type of queer and, let's say, queer decolonial, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist engagement that I was part of in France during the last 4 or 5 years or so, and seeing how, in responding to the question of decolonial translation, what we gained from the US approach, what got lost in translation, what did we, reinvent, and what can be missed that we are doing and that are not always, circulated, because the fact that we speak French in France makes an uneven circulation of the discussion between what we gain from the US, what we gain from the UK, but what we have to, give, but that does not get translated. And I think it's mostly the thing is, like, I would say that there is a very US centric understanding of race around the question of blackness, whiteness, anti-blackness, and whiteness as an hegemonic structure. And sometimes it makes very difficult for people to understand the peculiarity of French racism, which is not, I'm not saying that this is the only thing, but that goes beyond the question of colorism, because if you look at French data about racism, exclusion, very materialist understanding of racism, the two categories of population that are the most excluded are Romas, so the Romanis, and Arabs. So for example, if you try to understand French racism with the question of colorism and anti-blackness, you will, as the centerpiece, you will sometimes lose how, for example, racism is not based on this question of colorism. But adding to that, and this is where the French racialized order is complicated, you do have the same kind of US anti-Black order as a primary defining thing in the French context, but not so much in metropolitan France, but in the places that we know as former post-slave societies like Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion. And you do see in those places how blackness work as anti-blackness, so it works as the primary racialized order in relation to the French context. So the first thing I would like to say is, like, when we want to talk about queer decolonialities and all of that, we need to remember that the US was a former colonies, but that French was a former empire. So that French, when we talk about French, it's never only metropolitan France. There is France with how it works in the metropole, and there is also what we call the overseas territories, because it really changed the way one can think about race and one can think about them in relation to sexualities and all of that. So at first, I want to talk about my later experience, because I was brought up in the Caribbean, but I was not politicized in the Caribbean. So it's really interesting to see that the way I was brought up was not the way I got politicized around race and gender. I got politicized around race and gender officially when I came to Paris. So coming back then in the Caribbean, it made me see race and gender in very different way, and especially around the question of how you make claims, against whom, with whom do you make claim, when, especially when you are a sexual minority. So there will be a differences between Guadeloupe and France on that matter. And especially because in Guadeloupe, we don't call ourselves Black, we call ourselves Guadeloupeans. So that's also something, because there is when people are radical, they have nationalist more than racialized claim. It's about saying, this is my country, and not so much saying I'm Black. So that's one thing. So one of the things that we can say right now about the queer of color critique of in France, and that we call most of the time in French, people say queer racisé, so queer racialized, or queer non blanc, queer non white. It's that it's a burgeoning, let's say, field, not because there was nothing before, but because there are multiple forces that prevent us to know our heritage, the people that were there before us in the 60s and the 70s, who were, for example, trans women of color organizing in Paris and in Toulouse, in Marseille. So there is, and this is not only for queer people of color, it's true for all racialized subjects in France. There is a strong erasure of anti-colonial and now decolonial activists from the first wave of North African immigrants to today. So just add to that, if if the broader history of non-white people in France is hard to recover, let alone the queer dimension of that story. So for example, I do not have a complete picture of how that story was created, but I do have some of key points that I want to share with you. For example, that I discovered that in the 80s, if you were looking for example, homosexual, gay, or lesbian type of organizing in the name of immigrants and Arabs or Black, you will not find something explicit like this, but you will find in the anti-HIV activism, people organizing from North African origin and from Sub-Saharan African origin, using the words such as families against HIVs. And then you will see that in those type of organizing, so the political umbrella was not queer, it was families against, etc. And you understand why, because I was like, okay, why didn't they do something like, for example, the white queer movement saying homosexual men against HIV, men having sex with men against HIV? It's because I discovered that the level of HIV contamination was almost the same from what we call straight immigrants and queer immigrants. So this is why they organize around the question of being immigrants more than the sexual type of activity. So what that means is that when we go look for in the archives, we do not have to look for specific type of wording, specific type of modes of organization, but we need to look, let's say, beyond the lines. So it means that sometimes you will not find queer of color activism in the 80s or even before that as something separate, but as something that goes within the immigrant struggle. And so this is why sometimes it can become invisible, because we come to the archive and we've already pre-set questions. Where are the queers? Where are the gay men? Where are the lesbian women? Where are the transgender? When sometimes when we should ask is, how was the racialized subject voicing their concern about work, let's say police? And you do see that, oh, sometimes the queers of the immigrants emerge with the police question. Oh, with HIV and health, oh, the queer emerge. Oh, with question of reproductive right, sometimes lesbian women will emerge. So that is another way to ask question. And so that brings me to this point of, I think that in French, we had a very, let's say, strong opposition between the idea of what is politics and the idea of visibility and visibility, meaning that for most people, it feels like, when I was organizing over there, that you become, politic emerge when there is visible, identified claims. So if you do not have, I'm not even talking about using queer or not label, but just the simple fact of making claim is what makes you politics. When I think that in fact, there are other ways to be political without it to be something about making claims. And this is why I want to talk about Guadeloupe. Because when I went back to Guadeloupe, I discovered that there are queer organizing in the carnival. They do not call themselves queer, so I'm using queer as a way to relate in this discussion that we're having right now. But if I was writing, it will be queer with a lot of, guillemets. So what they're doing is that they're using the moment of carnival, which is a moment when you can officially dress the way you want, to be openly non-heterosexual. So it's not like people think this is a disguise. Everyone knows that this is not heterosexual men and heterosexual women. We know that we will call them lesbian or gays in other contexts. So everyone knows, but the carnival allows for this to become a little bit normalized. So I can understand, for example, that some issues may be raised. One can say, well, it's just one moment of the year. It doesn't mean that this is emancipation, because in other moments of the time, maybe those people will have to hide themselves. And I could agree with that, but what that suggests is that we don't understand, if we have a narrow understanding and a Eurocentric understanding of what politics is, maybe we will miss the political dimension of what they are doing in marching in the street of Pointe-à-Pitre, Bastille, and all the cities in Guadeloupe, having explicitly chanting sound, talking about love, about men and men, women and women, but not making claims, not saying we want rights and all of that. And why I am using this example is to say that maybe it's understandable that in the Western context, and not only Western, but big cities context, so really huge cities, because I think that sometimes we confuse Western and Eurocentrism with urbanization, because Guadeloupe is a small island of 400,000 people. And when we have a city, is maybe just a street for a metropolis. So what I want to say is that in small contexts like this, outside of the West, and that are not urbanized, such as big, huge cities, maybe the way that people want to address question in terms of sexual agencies, it's not about pitting against this group of oppressed person against this majority. I feel like they are all talking as Guadeloupeans, but want to voice a concern that they have, but there is not against someone. And so this forces me who was from Guadeloupe, but who stayed 10 years in France and coming back and looking for things and, with a very offensive discourse, I had to, with a lot of humility, saying, okay, they don't oppose the non-heterosexual against the heterosexual. They don't view the heterosexual as an oppressive force. They construct in the way they talk an abstract order that prevent everyone from being happy. Everyone from being happy because we don't have, we don't always have water here, or we don't have too much job here. And us as queer, we also have these issues. So it's like everyone has issues, and it's not this one against the other. So that would be my last word. I just want to say that the way we study queer, and I mean study, but also organize around issues of gender and sexualities, it cannot be only anti-racist, because anti-racist will mean, for example, oppose the way that white queer theories will produce discourse rendering people of color more homophobic, or sometimes invisibilize them, or sometimes use them as token. But the decolonial for me means going even beyond that. It's not so much to oppose the white queer discourse, but it's also to reinvent what can even be, what liberation can even be. So meaning, does the queer of the non-Western world and or of very small town outside of big countries have to look for something called sexual emancipation? Because I think that our issues in Guadeloupe is the poorer you are, so the less resourceful you are in terms of money means, the less you have intimacy. And people that I'm really interested in this question of intimacy and privacy back home, because I feel like the one who can claim that are the one who have a lot of money, really a lot of money. So you do understand that, for example, some of the main claim about this society about having a roof over your head, but not a tiny one, but a one with several bedrooms, several places where you can, you don't have to share space 24/7, but you can share space in certain time, allows people to have privacy and also prevent one of the things that will be my last word. One of the things that we add here is that I recollect testimonies of young people telling me that because they don't have space, because the places are small, they are working class, they often go to the rivers, but the rivers, there are people with really bad intention that can assault those people, knowing damn well that they will not say why they were in the river in the first place. So it means that if they formulate explicit sexual demands, maybe it won't work. But asking for better housing, asking for better resource, and asking for what the small tiny bourgeoisie of the island enjoy, because the bourgeoisie of Guadeloupe, they live like they're in New York, whether in terms of sexual morals and means. The very sexual conservatism is for the rest of us, not the bourgeoisie. So you do see that privacy is something that is related to class. And so I think that it helped me to rephrase what I've learned in Paris in using the Caribbean and seeing that in a new light. So thank you for the opportunity to share that with you.
Thank you so much, Joao, for giving such a wonderful, rich texture to the political and for opening up the political to a new set of discussions and imaginings and questions. Thank you so much